Hi, I know we're still wandering in, but we've got 50 minutes and it's already started, and somehow I'm supposed to cover 3 different philosophers in that time, so we'll have to get going. This is the first lecture, a common lecture for the CVSP 202 class, Intellectual History of the Abrahamic Traditions from Late Antiquity to the 13th Century. I'm James Broucek. I teach in the CVSP program. And obviously, I'm giving your first lecture. Just general requests, pleading from all of you. When this room is full, as it will be shortly, I don't know how many people we have in here, 300, something like that. If just 10% of you talk amongst yourselves, that generates a lot of noise. If just 10% of you look at your cell phones, that creates all kinds of distractions in my own mind as I'm trying to do my job. So please, for me and for the rest of the lecturers in here, you only have maybe 5 in this class. I ask your basic respect. Just give us your attention for the 50 minutes. If you talk, if you look at your cell phones, it makes our jobs harder. So if you could please try to do that, I would appreciate it. So would all the other lecturers, I'm sure. One other thing about time. We'll be out of here at 50 after. If at 50 after I'm still babbling and stumbling and bumbling and waving my arms around and stuff, you're free to go. I'm out of time. I didn't do my job well. But up until that minute, please don't pack up, because again, if only 10% of you do that, that generates a lot of noise, which makes my job a lot harder, okay? If we hit 150, my bad, you're free to go, right? But give me to that moment, please. I'd really appreciate it. And again, so will all the lecturers following me. Okay, so we're doing backgrounds today because a lot of what this class is about or focuses on is the way in which members of the Abrahamic traditions, we know what these are, right? Judaism, Christianity, Islam, ways in which members of the Abrahamic traditions struggled with the philosophical tradition stemming from ancient Greece. And we need to know a little bit about this background to get an idea of what these people are struggling with, where they're coming from, what assumptions they have in place, what assumptions they're challenging. So let's start off with the kind of question that Socrates would have asked himself. What is philosophy? Any brave volunteers to define it for me? Yes, up front here.
Structured.
Judith can give you a mic. Rock the mic. Go ahead.
I think that philosophy, my humble knowledge, would say that maybe a way of thought and how to process that thought in a very structured way with theories and counter theories and maybe limited to knowledge and reason and
a structured
logic.
Approach to thought, not a bad definition, right? A lot of what distinguishes philosophy is the techniques that are developed for thinking. This is some of the most prized possessions of the philosophers. Get another attempt up here. Go ahead, define philosophy for me.
I think philosophy is made of 2 words, philo and sophia, where philo is love and sophia is knowledge, or the opposite.
The opposite of love, the love of hate.
No, I mean, it's the love of knowledge.
Love of knowledge. Okay, this is what the word literally means. So it combines the words of love and knowledge or wisdom, right? So this is what Plato would say in the Republic. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. And Plato defines this in the broadest terms possible. For him, wisdom is basically any branch of learning, any branch of knowledge. So the philosopher is the person who loves all branches of learning, all branches of knowledge. And on the one hand, this definition is not that helpful because you want to ask the question, what's wisdom? I don't know. But on the other hand, it is, because it helps us realize that the way people are thinking about philosophy in Plato's time period is not the same way that we might think of it today. So today, we would commonly distinguish philosophy from something like science or mathematics or medicine or religion, okay? We have distinct categories in our minds when we use these terms. We have different departments at the university that study these things, right? In Plato's time period, you didn't have this distinction between philosophy and these other branches of knowledge. The philosophers were those who loved all branches of learning, all branches of knowledge. And the reason why I emphasize this is because one idea that I think would be good to avoid is you might get the idea that what we're talking about in this class is there was this thing called philosophy, this independent kind of knowledge or study, that was later taken up by religious folk. And these religious folk, when they took up philosophy, well, some of them were conservative and they hated it, and some of them were liberal and open-minded and they loved it, and they got into all these debates. That's not an accurate picture of the way things were, because there wasn't a clear distinction between philosophy and religion in Plato's time period. From the earliest origins of philosophy, we see philosophy and religion are joined at the hip. They exist together in this kind of controversial and dynamic relationship. And we see this in the life of Plato's teacher, Socrates. Okay? So Socrates, he's pictured here. This is an 18th century painting representing Socrates, his death sentence, actually. So Socrates actually took up philosophy for what we might want to call religious reasons, okay? Socrates never thought of himself as an especially wise person, but according to what Plato tells us, Socrates left no writings himself. He was Plato's teacher. All that we know, or we think we know about Socrates, most of it comes from Plato's writings, where Socrates is usually the main character or interlocutor. So according to Plato's writings, Socrates says one of his friends went to the Oracle of Delphi. Okay? We all know what oracles are? Raise our hands if we know what oracles are. Okay, 5 of us know what oracles are. What's an oracle? Just go ahead and shout it. A Greek religious figure that tells the future. Not a bad definition, right? Oracles were priests or priestesses who claimed to speak on behalf of one of the gods. So the Oracle of Delphi claimed to speak on behalf of the ancient Greek god Apollo. And it was one of the most respected of the oracles. If you had a problem in life, you can go to the oracle for guidance. If you needed prediction of the future, if you're trying to figure out when to plant crops or something like this, you can go to the oracle for questions. Well, for some reason, one of Socrates' friends went to the oracle and said, "Is anyone wiser than Socrates?" And for some reason, the oracle said no. So Socrates, when he learns this, is shocked. He never thought of himself as an especially smart or wise person, so he immediately did what Socrates would immediately do. He goes about trying to disprove the oracle, and he does this by basically approaching all the people in Athenian society who are regarded as wise and asking them about their wisdom. And what he thought he would do is he thought he would show that, in fact, he's not the wisest person alive, because look, there's this guy and this woman here, and they're all wiser than me in certain respects. But what he found again and again is when he questioned people about their wisdom, their alleged wisdom, he found that they actually didn't have any. Okay? So Socrates was especially interested in what we call moral knowledge. He would ask about questions like justice, courage, piety. What's piety? Huh? I can't hear. Where's the hand? Yes? Religiosity. Devotion or obedience to God or the gods. Yeah, that can be piety. So he would begin like I began. I said, what is philosophy? He would ask this person who claims to know what justice is, what is justice? Explain it to me. And he would hope that this person had what we could call a universal definition. So Socrates assumed that knowledge was the ability to provide a universal definition. That means if I know what justice is, then I can give you a definition of justice that explains every single instance of justice. It's an example that explains every time we call something just. If I can't give you a definition like this, then I don't actually have knowledge of justice. So the typical early dialogues that people think reflect Socrates most accurately, they'll begin by him finding someone who claims to be an expert on justice or piety or courage. He'll ask them, for example, what's justice? They'll give them his definition, and then he'll start to press back and ask some critical questions. And then they'll start to get frustrated, they'll get confused, they'll find they can't answer his questions, and these early dialogues pretty much always end in confusion. Somebody walking away from Socrates upset, confused, saying, look at the time, I gotta go, okay? Has Socrates answered the question, what is justice at the end of the dialogue? No, he has not. But he's shown that this person, who claimed to be wise and know what justice is, actually doesn't have knowledge of justice. So this is what Socrates looks like in the early dialogues. We see in these dialogues maybe two different ways that Socrates would have been perceived in early Athenian society. So he presented himself as a kind of midwife to other people's ideas. And I have a passage here on the handout, if you look at it. This comes from Plato's Theaetetus. So it's Socrates speaking. And he says, "My art of midwifery is in most respects like theirs," that is, the midwives, "but differs in that I attend men and not women, and look after their souls when they are in labor, and not after their bodies. The triumph of my art is in thoroughly examining whether the thought which the mind of the young man brings forth is a false idol or a noble and true birth. And like the midwives, I am barren, and the reproach which is often made against me, that I ask questions of others and have not the wit to answer them, is very just. The reason is that the God compels me to be a midwife, but does not allow me to bring forth." Okay? So here you have Socrates saying, again, religious motivation for doing philosophy. The gods have compelled him to do philosophy. Okay? But he himself is barren of ideas. He doesn't claim to know what justice is. He doesn't present a view or a theory of justice in these early dialogues. Instead, what he is someone who helps to bring about one's ideas, like a midwife helps to bring about babies. And he does this through critical questions that lead you to reflect and maybe rethink your previous judgments. Now, for people who loved and respected Socrates, like Plato, he was a kind of midwife to ideas. He helped make your ideas better. Even if you left a conversation with him confused, you thought you knew what justice was, and now you have no idea. For some of us, that will be a good conversation because you recognize you need to go back and rethink some deeply held beliefs. Some people appreciate that kind of experience. But maybe the majority of people, definitely the majority of people in Athens of Socrates' time, they don't find this experience so edifying or pleasurable. They're pissed. They're annoyed. This guy's just wasting my time. He's confusing people. He's better to be avoided. He's crazy, okay? These are all the kind of public perceptions of Socrates at the time. And they had a large part in Socrates' death. So a number of Plato's dialogues actually talk about the trial and death of Socrates. Socrates was convicted of leading Athenian youth astray. Specifically, he was charged with teaching them to worship new kinds of spirits and abandon the classical Greek gods. He was found guilty of this, and he was given the death penalty, okay? And that's what's being pictured here. He's drinking a potion known as hemlock, which was poisonous, okay? This is the way Socrates died, right? Did he actually teach people to disbelieve in the ancient Greek gods? We don't know because none of his writings have survived. From what Plato tells us, he never said this directly, but he was critical of ancient Greek religion. So for a lot of his contemporaries, the most authoritative sources when it came to knowledge of the gods, these were the works of great poets like Homer or Hesiod. Okay? We do see Socrates criticize these works in Plato's dialogues. He says, look at the way these gods are depicted. We see them murdering others. We see them going to war over petty jealousies. This can't be an accurate depiction of the gods. Why would we worship or respect gods like this? These must just be stories that the poets are telling for entertainment. Okay? So some people would think this is a good corrective of our religious beliefs, because why should I worship a god who murders people for petty reasons? But others would say, no, this guy is confusing people, leading them astray. He's dangerous, right? And it's this same kind of dynamic conflict between philosophy and religion, going all the way back to Socrates' time, that we're going to see playing out in the readings for the semester. So when we see, for example, Islamic scholars like Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, right, arguing about whether or not it's appropriate to do philosophy, arguing about the authority of scriptural texts, these are going to be conversations that echo debates that go all the way back to Socrates' time. So why did I add an extra person when I already have too much to cover? I don't know. I'm not very bright. Let's get to the readings that we actually are doing now. So Plato is Socrates' most famous student, and it's probably safe to say the most famous philosopher, period. Again, pretty much all we know of Socrates comes from Plato's dialogues, and we read a small snippet of one of these dialogues, a snippet of the Republic. Hopefully some of you have had a chance to look at this. So Plato took up Socrates' idea of knowledge. So for Socrates, again, if I have knowledge of something, I can provide a universal definition of it. I can define it in such a way that it explains every instance of that thing. But Plato was also influenced by a pre-Socratic philosopher whose name was Heraclitus. Heraclitus came from Ephesus in modern-day Turkey, and I have a passage on the handout from Heraclitus that was very influential for Plato's thought. So Heraclitus taught that all sensible things are in a state of flux, and there is no such thing as knowledge of them. Okay? All sensible things are in a state of flux, and there is no such thing as knowledge of them. This idea heavily impacted Plato, the idea that we can't have knowledge of sensible things. So he agreed with the claim that sensible things, I just mean everyday, ordinary objects that we can sense, that we can see, that we can touch, right? That we can smell, etc. Sensible objects for Plato are in flux in the sense that their properties, their features, are always relative to other things, okay? So we could take the idea of a feature or a property like roundness, okay? I might say that someone's head is round compared to someone else's head or compared to their foot. But at the same time, if I compared their head to a basketball, I would say that their head is not round. The basketball is the rounder thing, right? The basketball is round relative to the person's head, but likewise, if I compared the basketball to like a ball bearing, the basketball now appears to not be round. The ball bearing seems like the roundest thing. So for Plato, these things are in flux in the sense that they are round and not round at the same time. They are round and not round at the same time in the sense that we judge them as round relative to other things we see. Okay? And for Plato, this is a problem for knowledge. Because how is it possible for us to know what roundness is if our knowledge all derives from sensible things? We actually, in physical reality, the sensible world, we don't encounter perfectly round circles or perfectly round spheres. Okay? So if all of our knowledge derived from these kinds of sensible things, we would never have the idea of actual roundness. We would only have the idea of roundness relative to other things. Yet, oddly, we do have what Socrates could respect as knowledge of roundness. We can come up with a definition of roundness that seems to fit, right? All cases. We can say a round object is an object whose shape is such that its circumference is equidistant from its center, right? That is true roundness, whether or not we experience such a thing. Right? So for Plato, the question is, where does this idea of true roundness come from if it can't come from the sensible world? He agreed with Heraclitus that we cannot know the sensible world. So this sent him to ask where these ideas come from. And he called these ideas forms. So we can think of forms as properties or features of things in themselves. Take any group of things, things like this here, a clock, a coin, and a donut. We see examples of all kinds of features or properties on these things. So obviously we see roundness shared by all of them. We see colors like pinkness or whiteness. We can talk about weight. We can talk about hardness, right? All of these things for Plato can count as forms. Now, we see these kinds of features on sensible objects, but the sensible objects will never allow us to understand what these features are in themselves, okay? So the quest for knowledge for Plato is the quest for understanding what are these properties in themselves? What is the true knowledge of these forms? One way Plato defined forms in the Republics, he defined forms, he said, we always postulate a single form for each set of particular things which we apply the same name, okay? So if we have a bunch of things that we call round, there can be a form of roundness. If we have a bunch of things that we call clocks or we call donuts, there can be a form of donutness or of clockness. And because Plato was influenced by Heraclitus, he argued that these forms cannot be found in the sensible world. So this led him to develop what we call his theory of forms. And this is what's being discussed in the readings from the Republic, okay? So basically, Plato posited that there are two different realms or two different areas, levels of reality. On the one hand, we have the level of reality that we're all familiar with in day-to-day life. So this is apparent reality. This is the realm of changing sensible objects that exist in space and time. Okay? It's apparent in the sense that it appears to be real. It seems to be real. Most of us assume that this is what reality is, the world of sensible objects that we bump up against on a day-to-day basis. But for Plato, this can't be what is really real. Because again, when we talk about roundness in sensible things, they are at the same time both round and not round. Or the way Plato would put it, he would say, at the same time they both are and are not, in the sense of roundness. So where are we going to find true reality? In what Plato posited as the second level of reality. Okay, we can call this ultimate reality. This is the realm of unchanging, intelligible forms that exist outside of space and time, right? And the task of philosophy for Plato, if philosophy is the love of wisdom, the love of knowledge in all its forms, the philosopher is one who strives to know the forms. This is where true knowledge is, right? This is where you're going to find the true definition of roundness or of pinkness or of donutness or whatever form you want to come up with, okay? So this is the general schematic, the general view of reality that's supposed to be represented in the passage we read from the Republic called Plato's Simile of the Cave. So we know the general story of the simile. Socrates says, imagine in the past we had people who from birth, earliest age, were tied up in the bottom of a cave, and all they could see is the wall in front of them. They were tied up in such a way that they couldn't even turn their heads. They couldn't even see their own bodies or the people tied up next to them, right? And behind them in the cave, we're told that there's a fire. And in between them and the fire, there's a road. Why is there a road at the bottom of a cave? I have no idea. This is Plato's example. So there's a road in the cave, and people are walking back and forth on this road in between the fire and the wall that the prisoners face, and they're carrying different objects. All these people know from the earliest time that they're forming memories is this reality. All that they ever see are these shadows going across the wall. They have no concept of human bodies. They can't see their own bodies. They have no concept of any of the things that you and I take for granted. They have no concept of the road or the fire behind them. All they know is these shadows, and this is what is really real to them. Okay? Socrates says, imagine that one of these prisoners was freed, okay, and allowed to wander up to the road in the flame. What would this person's response be? Would this person be thankful that you freed me so now I can see the rest of the world? At first, Socrates thinks probably not. This person would be terrified. This person would not even be able to look at the things around the fire because it would be too bright for his or her eyes at first. Okay? The person would be shocked by seeing the people walking back and forth and holding objects. The person would want to return to join the rest of those who are chained up so he can feel familiar and comfortable again, right? So this story is kind of a metaphor for the way in which we learn the truth. It's not something that's pleasurable or fun at first. It's painful. It requires great effort, great patience. And this is only a small part of the shock. Because, of course, the cave is not the entire world. The entire world is outside the cave. So if you were to force this person out even farther, to leave the cave, again, he would be temporarily blinded by the brightness of the sun. Again, he would be overwhelmed by all of the different strange objects around him. And it would take a long time for him to understand that what he thought of as reality was just a tiny piece of what is, a tiny piece of what is real. Okay? So this is supposed to be a metaphor to give us an idea of what it's like for most of us who think that ultimate reality is the world of sensible objects, as we start to slowly learn that, no, in fact, what is really real is the realm of the forms. Okay? This idea might be tough to grasp at first. For Plato, it should be. Just like it's tough at first for someone to look at the objects around the fire because his eyes have not yet adjusted. Okay? So if this is supposed to be a metaphor for what it's like to learn of the forms, what does the cave represent? What are the different spaces here? Where do we find the world of forms, and where do we find the world of sensible things? Any guesses? Yeah. The world of sensible things is the cave. The world of forms is everything else. So the world of forms is the outside world. What's beyond the fire and the people is the forms. This is what you're saying. Initially, the fire and the people are the forms. Okay? Do we all agree? The fire and the people are initially supposed to represent forms. And then as we go out into the real world, we see perhaps realer or deeper forms, something like this. Sorry, speak up. The world of forms is outside the cave. Well then, what is the fire supposed to represent inside the cave? Knowledge? Part of the truth, imagination. Socrates actually interprets this for us. He actually gives us a key to understanding what these symbols are. It's not knowledge, it's not truth, it's not imagination. Any other guesses? Realization? No, it's much simpler than that. The fire represents the physical sun in our world. So the physical sun in our sensible world is what provides light that allows us to see all of the sensible objects. Okay? The sensible objects are the people walking back and forth on the road. The shadows are reflections of sensible objects. We also encounter reflections, lesser copies of sensible objects in day-to-day life. For example, shadows. For example, a reflection in a pond, something like this. Okay? We all recognize that shadows and reflections are less real than the things that cause them. Okay? But these people at first are in this least real realm of reality, we can say, the shadows. The sensible objects are the people walking back and forth. The fire is the sun in the physical world. And when he emerges from the cave, outside of the cave, this is the realm of forms. And what is going to be the highest of forms in the realm of forms for Plato? The good, the form of the good. He talks about this as the origin of all forms in the Republic. So it's the sun outside of the cave that represents the form of the good. The sun outside the cave allows the person to see all the things outside the cave, just as the form of the good for Plato allows us to know all of the other forms. Okay? So this is a quick synopsis of Plato's view of reality. One last thing to mention, he does have a difficulty if he wants to claim that objects of knowledge are forms. I can't know something unless I know the form of that thing. And his problem is, he claimed that we can't know the sensible world. So how am I going to learn of the forms? One way Plato tried to answer this question is he introduced the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. So Plato introduces this view that the soul is eternal. It has existed before it was put into our current bodies. And before the soul was put into our current bodies, the soul existed among the forms, which is where the soul learned of the forms. So for Plato, when we're learning, when we're being educated, when we're discovering knowledge, what we're actually doing is we're remembering. We're being reminded of forms that we previously knew. And this is Socrates' point when he says, people who claim that teaching is implanting knowledge in someone's mind, they're wrong, okay? Teaching is more a matter of turning one in the right direction so that they can perceive the world correctly, so that they can remember the forms that they already know, okay? So this is Plato's view. And in many ways, it's going to be shared by his most famous student, Aristotle. This is a painting by Raphael called The School of Athens, and it's a snippet of it. In the middle, it shows Plato and Aristotle. You can recognize them because Plato's holding his book, the Timaeus. Aristotle's holding his book, the Ethics. And most people think it's significant here that Plato is pointing upwards and Aristotle is gesturing more down towards the earth, right? So the idea, most people say, is that Plato is gesturing towards the realm of ideal forms. Ideal forms exist outside of space and time. They're not really up. But even Plato himself uses ideas of higher and lower knowledge, for example. So this kind of metaphor of the forms being higher knowledge, you'll see this language also persists in Augustine, higher things and lower things, okay? That's being reinforced here with Plato pointing up. Aristotle, on the other hand, is gesturing down towards the earth. So Aristotle, unlike Plato, he did not think that it's impossible to know the sensible world. Aristotle is much more trusting of our perceptions of sensible things as a source of knowledge. And you see this in the very first sentences of our reading. If you look at the opening passage from Book 1 of Metaphysics. I don't have it here. Well, if you look at the very first passage in Metaphysics, Aristotle talks about how people love knowledge, and because of this, they love to sense things. And above all, they love the sense of sight, because the sense of sight provides the most knowledge. This does not sound like Platonic language, the way Plato is so skeptical of sensible things as a source of knowledge. Aristotle thinks that they are good guides for knowledge, and Aristotle actually rejected one of his teachers, Plato's teachings, the one that we just talked about. He rejected the idea that the realm of forms can be separated from the realm of sensible objects. So Plato would say what is really real, what is ultimate reality, is the realm of forms. Aristotle would say this doesn't make sense. Forms can't exist without sensible objects. In order for there to be pinkness or roundness, there needs to be a thing that is pink or that is round. When there is such a thing, we can talk about these properties existing. But without such a thing, it doesn't make sense. What he argued the primary being, or the most real realm of reality is what he called substance. And substances are basically what Plato meant as sensible things. We can think of a substance as a table, a chair, a person, anything we want to point to. Substance we can define more technically as particular instances of informed matter. So for Aristotle, all things that you point to, all sensible things, consist of two basic components. Matter. Matter is the stuff that it's made of. So if I'm talking about a thing like a human being, the matter of a human being would be things like tissues and bones and organs and that kind of stuff. For Aristotle, all matter ultimately boils down to four elements. These are earth, air, water, and fire. So all things are made of stuff. This is matter. But what makes something a substance, instead of just a pile of matter, is that it has a kind of form, right? And we can think of the form as the essential definition of a thing. So the form of a substance is what makes that substance a specific kind of thing. So again, if we're talking about human beings, a lot of people might say that the form of a human being would entail something like rationality. Some people might define human beings as rational animals, like Thomas Aquinas, who you'll read later, okay? What makes this body, not just organs, tissues, bones, etc., is that it has this form within it, this essential definition to it. If you were to take this form away, it would no longer be a human being, okay? So for Aristotle, the way that we come to learn the forms is we basically generalize from experience. It's a kind of bottom-up approach. We encounter sensible things, we recognize commonalities, patterns between them, we form memories, and we generalize from our experiences these concepts of general properties. People refer to Aristotle's view of reality as hylomorphism. Hylo is related to the word for matter. Morphe is related to the word for form. So it's just a way of saying that his view of reality is that reality is a compound of matter and form. This is where we find the really real. And yes, knowledge can be derived from this compound of matter and form that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. So he gives a couple of criticisms of Plato's theory of the forms. One major criticism he gives is he says, Plato can't explain how exactly ideal forms create changes within substances. So if Plato was looking at a pink donut, Plato would say something like, the donut participates in the form of roundness, or it participates in the form of pinkness. But that doesn't really explain how that pink donut came about, right? What caused matter to take this specific shape, to take on the form of this specific substance that we call a pink donut? Aristotle thought that these questions were an important part of knowledge. And if we want to ask these questions, we need to get at the causes of things. Ideal forms alone don't reveal the causes of things. So Aristotle said, when we're talking about how substances change, we need to think in terms of 4 different causes. And a lot of people say maybe the better word to use here is 4 different explanations. There are 4 different ways of explaining how a certain substance became that kind of thing. So first of all, we're going to ask about the material cause of that thing. So here we have a picture of a statue of Aristotle, right? It's composed of matter. Here, the matter is marble. So part of what makes this statue what it is, this particular substance, is that it's composed of marble. If it was composed of something else, it would be a different statue. We also want to ask about the formal cause of that thing. Okay? What is the essential definition of this thing? What is the property that if you took it away, it would not be that substance anymore? So we could say the formal cause, the formal explanation of this statue is, well, one, obviously that it's a statue, right? If I decided that I needed to build a new pillar in my house and I didn't have enough materials lying around, and I lopped off the head of the statue and I shaved off the arms and I just stuck it in the place of the pillar, it wouldn't be a statue anymore, and it wouldn't be the same substance. So part of the essence of this thing is that it's a statue. We might even say part of its essence is that it's a representation of Aristotle. The efficient cause. What is it that brought about the change in this matter to make it this substance? When we're talking about statues, we can obviously talk about statue makers, right? This is part of the efficient cause. We can talk about the quarry where the marble was dug up and people brought it to the sculpture maker. This is also part of the efficient cause. And lastly, we can talk about the final cause that makes this substance what it is. For Aristotle, the final cause explains what this thing was made for. What is the purpose of this thing? So for a statue is made, in this case, maybe to represent Aristotle, maybe to bring aesthetic enjoyment to some kind of patron. These all have to do with the why, the function, what it was for. When we talk about artifacts, this 4-causal theory is pretty easy to follow. It maybe is a little harder to follow when we talk about natural things, but Aristotle thought it applied just as directly. So here we have a picture of an acorn, and above it, what an acorn becomes, an oak tree. For Aristotle, he's interested in explaining change in the sensible world. He wants to be able to come up with an account of how an acorn becomes an oak tree. And for him, this account would, again, go back to all of these causes, right? So the material cause is the actual stuff, the matter of the acorn, right? The formal cause, this acorn, part of its essence is that it is meant to become an oak tree. No other seeds become oak trees, right? So this, if you were to take that quality away from it, it wouldn't be an acorn anymore. It would be something else. So we can say it's formal cause, right? It's formal explanation. It's the seed of an oak tree. It's efficient cause. These are the things that bring about the change that make the acorn into the oak tree. We can talk about things like sunlight, water, soil, etc. And lastly, the final cause. What is this thing for? Okay? An acorn is meant to become an oak tree. This is what it's for. And we know that it's for this because this is what happens when you plant an acorn in the appropriate conditions. It doesn't sometimes become a corn plant and sometimes become an automobile and sometimes become a human being. It always becomes an oak tree, right? So this is what it's for. We could maybe extend this further and say it's for the purpose of producing other oak trees. Okay? So we see in the readings we read from Aristotle, he's more interested in explaining change in the sensible world than Plato was. He's more confident in knowledge of the sensible world than Plato was. He thinks understanding these 4 causes is key to this knowledge. Another criticism he raises against Plato that we'll see brought up in other readings is he says, Plato basically tells us that whenever we have the same name used for different things, we're talking about a form. So if I see two different things that are round, we can talk about the form of roundness. If I see a bunch of things that are called donuts, we can talk about the form of donutness. But Aristotle argued that this is not always the case, right? Things with common names don't have to be forms. Sometimes this assumption can lead us astray. In his book, The Ethics, he gives the example of good. Aristotle says when you think about the way we use the word good, we use it in totally different ways in totally different contexts, and that doesn't suggest that these different usages are describing one form, okay? So he gives examples like this, right? We can say a sentence like, good people are virtuous people. Here when we say good, we mean virtue, and here we're describing a kind of quality, right? A quality of a person that they happen to be virtuous. We can say there's a good amount of salt in this dish. When I'm saying there's a good amount of salt in this dish, I mean that there's a moderate amount, not too much salt, not too little salt. Here, I'm not talking about a quality, I'm talking about a quantity, an amount. This is a totally different kind of thing. I can say, this is a good hammer for the job. If I say this is a good hammer for the job, what I mean by good here is not virtuous, not moderate. I mean something like useful, okay? This is an appropriate hammer for this job. And that is going to be a judgment of relation. Hammers become useful based on their relation to the other parts of a job. Some jobs require a rubber mallet. Some jobs require a ballpoint hammer. Don't ask me what a ballpoint hammer is. I'm not even sure that's a thing, but I think it is. You get the idea. Lastly, this new job opening is a good opportunity. Here we're talking about time, and good means something like timely. Well, these uses of good describe totally different things: quality, quantity, relation, time. For this reason, Aristotle argued there is no such thing as the form of the good. Although we have this word that we use a lot, it's used in so many different ways, it doesn't describe a coherent form. He would call words like this, like good, I always mess this word up. I know how to say homonym, but homonymous is hard for me. He would call these homonymous words, okay? And we know what a homonym is, right? Homonyms are words with the same sound, but different meanings. That's all these kinds of words are. They have the same sound, but they don't have the same meaning, which means there's not a common form underlying them. So we'll see this kind of idea come up, for example, in Maimonides' readings later. He'll say when we're talking about God and when we're talking about created things, we're talking about totally different categories, right? So we can talk about, for example, God's power. We can talk about, for example, God's justice, but we can't mean the same thing that we mean when we talk about power or justice in the created world, because they're totally different categories. So these are merely homonyms, right? And this is one way that he tries to argue we can't really know anything about God's properties. So very briefly, I'm trying to give you an idea of what Plato and Aristotle thought they were up to, what's going on in our readings, what are some of the themes that we'll see continue to be discussed throughout the rest of our readings. Another theme we can talk about with Aristotle is he had so much faith in the ability to derive knowledge from the sensible world that he actually thought that he could derive the knowledge of God's existence from the sensible world around him. And we see in the metaphysics, for example, where he argues things like we see that there is motion in the world, and this motion requires that there must be something like an unmoved mover. And this unmoved mover must be God. These arguments we'll see brought up pretty much in the exact same form by Thomas Aquinas, who's heavily influenced by Aristotle, okay? So we'll see his influence there as well. The way that I've represented Plato and Aristotle, you might get the idea that they have this sort of antagonistic relationship. They're polar opposites, right? One has the theory of forms, the other has the entire opposite theory. But this isn't the way that Aristotle would have seen it. Aristotle saw himself as a descendant of the Platonic school. He studied under Plato for 20 years. Yes, there were points where he would disagree with Plato, but there was many others where he would agree. And many of the followers of Plato perceived them as all part of the same school. And this brings us to the last person we'll talk about. This is Plotinus. So Plotinus is the founder of the school that we call Neoplatonism or New Platonism. But Plotinus didn't imagine himself as a new Platonist. He never uses this term. It's a term that was coined much later by historians. He just considered himself a Platonist. So he was a proponent of the Platonic tradition of philosophy in his mind, but he really created this unique synthesis of Plato's ideas along with many other thinkers, among them Aristotle. He read deeply of Aristotle, and he saw Plato and Aristotle all participating in the same tradition. So if you look at the handout here, I have one quote from Plotinus. This is from his Aeneads, where he says, "What we say," he's talking about himself, "what we say represents no novelty, nothing new, and was said not now but long ago, though in inexplicit fashion. Our present exposition is merely an exegesis of what was said then, and relies for its proof of antiquity on the writings of Plato himself." So for Plotinus's money, all he's doing is he's finishing the unfinished thoughts of Plato and Plato's contemporaries. He's worth bringing up because we'll start off reading Augustine as we get into the texts from the Abrahamic traditions. Augustine will talk a lot about Platonism. He's reading all kinds of Platonic texts, and many of them are coming from this Neoplatonic tradition, okay? But again, he doesn't have the word Neoplatonism. It's not a category yet. This is just the Platonist branch of learning. So Augustine would have encountered Aristotle's ideas, for example, through the writings of the people that he calls the Platonists. So one of the interesting and challenging innovations, Plotinus wouldn't have said innovation, he would have said continuation of Platonic thought that he develops, is this idea of the one, which he also calls the good. So like Plato and also like Aristotle, Plotinus was a monist. Monist means you believe that all of reality is one thing. It derives from one common principle, one common source, right? For Plato, all of reality derives in the Republic from the form of the good. For Aristotle, he would have said all of reality derives from the one God, which is the God that is God thinking God's self. Okay, this is his argument in metaphysics. Plotinus combines these kinds of ideas to create this idea of the one. Unlike Plato, he argues that the one is somehow transcendent to or outside of being. He argues that if we agree that the one is the source of all things that exist, then the one itself cannot exist. It must somehow be, he says, not being. Okay? And this is maybe analogous to Aristotle's argument that since things move, they must necessarily depend on some kind of unmoved mover, right? This is a very challenging idea. You'll see when you read Plotinus, it's tough going. It's tough going for everybody. If they tell you it's not, they're lying to you. But he himself admits this is a hard idea to think. He says that perhaps this idea is unthinkable, right? And we'll see this idea come to influence some of the writers in the monotheistic tradition who start to argue that God must be something like this. God as the source of all things must be radically different than what exists or being itself, which means that we can't have any positive knowledge of God's essence, okay? So someone like Maimonides, you'll see arguing that, for example, there's nothing positive that we can say God is. We can only say what God is not, all right? Other than this, there's lots more to discuss in all these thinkers, but I certainly don't have the time to do it. Thank you so much for your attention, and good luck with the semester. Thank you.